There are two histories in Britain, a fake version that was invented in Oxford and Cambridge, and the other one is real British history. Ancient British histories before 1688 bear little or no resemblance to later 19th century politically correct versions. King Arthur is in fact two historical figures rolled into one. The first being the Arthur I, who was the son of Magnus Maximus. The second one being Arthur II, who was the son of Myrig. Both were South Wales kings. There is in fact an abundance of evidence that these two people existed within the authentic Cymric writings, manuscripts and poems. The story of King Arthur really begins with Constantine the Great, for both Arthur I and Arthur II were his direct descendants. The British had married into the Imperial Roman bloodline during the short-lived conquest of Britain between AD 51 and AD 80, and when an heirless Emperor Hadrian came to Britain in AD 124, he offered the British a deal which would make British princes legitimate Roman emperors in exchange for opening up trade routes between Britain and the Roman Empire. Following Hadrian's death in AD 138, there was an era when British emperors ruled the Roman Empire, followed by the effective collapse of the empire in AD 235. At this time, Britain had split off into a separate Western Empire, comprising of Britain, Gaul and Spain. Eventually, the British Constantine the Great re-established British rule over the entire empire. Constantine's first wife was Minerva, by whom he had his eldest son, Flavius Julius Crispus Caesar. In turn, the young Crispus married Fausta, and they had one son, Magnus Clemens Maximus, who was born in AD 324. Crispus and Fausta came to a tragic end when Constantine had them murdered after his second wife poisoned his mind against them. The child, Magnus Maximus, then an infant in his first year, was taken to Spain by his guardian, the Spanish Christian knight named Aelius Severus. By the time Magnus Maximus had reached adulthood, he had gone back to Britain and reclaimed his British patrimony, married Ceindrech, the daughter of Rheiden, and had children. The eldest son of Magnus Maximus and Ceindrech was Arthur I, so Arthur I was therefore the great-grandson of Constantine the Great. Arthur I is recorded as killing the Irish prince Reuth near Snowdon in AD 367. Presumably, he was in his early 20s at that time, so we can estimate his birth around 344 AD. The Irish prince Reuth appears in Welsh traditional tales as Rhitta Gawr, and in romance stories as King Ryons. In AD 383, Arthur I, as Andragathius in the Latin texts, was the general of the 62,000-strong armies belonging to his father, Magnus Maximus, whom he led across the Channel in the invasion of Gaul, where he went on to storm Paris, and he captured the city held by the Lady Saint Genevieve. This siege of Paris in AD 383 is commemorated in a carving at Medina Cathedral. He then defeated the massed armies of the Emperor Gratian at Soissons, the Battle of Sassy. The victorious Arthur I pursued the pretender Gratian to Lugdunum, Lyon, where he executed him. Arthur I and his father, Maximus, moved south through Switzerland. He seized Italy, and a mosaic in the Cathedral of Taranto in southern Italy depicts Arthur I. He then moved his armies across into Greece and the Balkans to meet the threat from Theodosius of Constantinople. Here he acquired the title King of Greece, as stated in British manuscripts. In AD 388, two major battles were fought in what would later become Yugoslavia. The first at Poetovio and the second at Sisika on the Sika River. The outnumbered forces of Arthur I were defeated, and he was forced to flee back to Britain, where he retired and lived out the rest of his life in quiet in Warwickshire, where he became the folk hero Guy of Warwick. King Arthur I died in AD 400. He was succeeded by Constantine III. Over 100 years later, Arthur II was born in AD 506, according to the Llandaff Charters. We know from numbers of genealogies that Arthur II was a sixth-generation direct male descendant of Arthur I, son of Magnus Maximus. A lot had happened in the intervening years between the two Arthurs, which would have an outstanding effect on King Arthur II's reign. 100 years before Arthur II's birth, in AD 406, the German Confederation of the Vandals, the Sueves, and the Alans crossed the Rhine into Gaul, and they proceeded to smash the Roman army, and then commenced the wholesale destruction of Gaul. King Constantine III assembled the British army, and with his general Geraint, he invaded Gaul. The objective was to restore the Western Empire and to keep the German hordes away from the Channel and Britain. The British army decisively defeated the Vandals, Sueves and Alans and penned them into the south of Gaul, and General Geraint blocked the passes of the Pyrenees. In AD 411, Geraint opened the passes and the whole horde crossed south into Spain. The Sueves and the Alans seized much of Spain, and the Vandals went further south, and in AD 422, led by their king Gaiseric, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa. The Vandals quickly seized all of North Africa and made the cities of Carthage and Hippo their main bases. Gaiseric built fleets, and in a very short time, the Mediterranean had become a Vandal lake. Rome was forced to surrender itself to the Vandals, and the Vandal German kings became known as the Kings of Africa. The Vandals dominated the Mediterranean for over 100 years. Events then proceeded into the time of King Arthur II. In AD 532, the Emperor Justinian of Constantinople seized an opportunity and sent his general Belisarius to attack Carthage because the entire Vandal army and fleets was away conquering Sardinia, and Belisarius had only boys and old men to oppose him. The Vandal king returned home with his army and found that he could not enter his own capital of Carthage. For 15 years, a savage war was fought that devastated North Africa, and finally in AD 548, the Vandal king gathered his huge fleets and put his entire nation of some 165,000 persons on board and sailed to Ireland. Vandal war fleets in excess of 500 ships were commonplace. King Arthur II assembled the British army and crossed over to southern Ireland to assist kings descended from Ceredig, son of Cuneda. After one battle with the Irish army, the Vandals boarded their ships at night and crossed over into Wales, leaving the British King Arthur II and his armies behind them in Ireland. The British army followed the Vandals back to Wales, and a savage campaign of pursuits followed as the Vandals had split up into 9 groups to try and get enough food as they moved eastwards across South Wales and into Lloegr. Lloegr is the Welsh word for the lands to the east of Wales, now known as England. The remnant of the Vandals finally got across the River Severn and moved east to settle in the East Midlands of what is now England, and they became known as the Mercians. The Vandal Mercians arrived in AD 548, but only 14 years after this event, a great tragedy struck the Arthurian kingdom of Britain in AD 562. In 1986, Dr. Victor Clube, head of the Oxford University Astrophysics Department, came to the conclusion that debris from a comet, or less likely from a giant meteor or giant asteroids, had totally devastated Britain in the mid-6th century AD. He estimated that the destruction caused was the equivalent of that caused by 100 Hiroshima atomic bombs. In 2003, Dr. Derek Ward-Thompson of Cardiff University Astronomy Department published that a comet disaster had disastrously affected Britain in the mid-6th century AD. The dogma of the Church of Rome held that no stone, meaning meteorites, asteroids or comets, could fall from the sky, not until 1803, when a great shower of meteorites fell close to a European potentate who was holding a ceremony in public before many thousands of people, did the church dogma begin to crack. Another similar shower of meteorites then fell close to large numbers of people in France, and it had to be finally admitted that stones can and do fall from the sky. It is clear from the Qumric records that a tauric object, comet or asteroid debris struck Britain in AD 562, causing immense widespread devastation. These records, which for centuries the Normans and their successors were unable to read and refused to believe. The British state was virtually destroyed and severely depopulated, and for 7 to 11 years in the mid-6th century, much of the land was uninhabitable. Some survivors fled to kinsmen in Brittany and Lliwlod, aka Normandy. At the time of the comet's hit, Arthur II's brother, Prince Madoc, was at sea. The great storms that occurred from the comet strike blew him far off course, and to everyone's amazement, he appeared again 10 years later when life was returning to the devastated island of Britain, with a story that he had found a vast fertile land across the Atlantic. Madoc's account of the vast new land of huge rivers, mountains and plains were disbelieved, and the king sent over Admiral Gwenon to check on Madoc's star reckonings and discoveries. Admiral Gwenon made the voyage and returned to verify Madoc's account in around 573 AD. Following this, King Arthur II began transferring his people out of the devastated British Isles. There are several detailed descriptions of Prince Madoc's voyages in 6th century Cymric records. His voyages were well known during the 19th century, and there were several hundreds of books, learned papers, and monographs written about Prince Madoc and his voyages to America. However, there had been a failure to properly identify him because people were unaware of the records that state that he was the brother of Arthur II, thus placing him in the correct era. When this is done, the stories make sense. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence that Prince Madoc existed, including the life of Saint Tylo and all 3 series of the Welsh triads. An ancient poem titled Englynion Mython, the Conversational Meters, details a conversation between King Arthur II and his nephew Lliwlod, son of Madoc. The introductory text states that they are discussing the discovery of Eryr. Eryr means towards that which is opposite, and should not be confused with Eryri, which indicates a land of eagles, and is normally the identification of Snowdonia in northwest Wales. Eryr is the identification of the great new lands far away, towards that which is opposite. The British were aware of North Africa and the lands of the eastern Mediterranean. There are many recorded journeys of the British into these territories which prove this. So when Arthur poses questions in the verses about a strange new land, they are definitely not discussing North Africa or anywhere else around the Mediterranean. The conversation outlined between Arthur II and Lliwlod reveals the following. At first, King Arthur is not fully convinced that Eryr or America truly existed, and is surprised that it was undamaged by the comet. Lliwlod tells Arthur that he is living proof of the existence of Eryr and that it is inhabitable. Arthur goes on to ask about the lands of Eryr and whether they are suited for cultivation. The dialogue continues, with Arthur stating that although Eryr exists, the distance is so great that it might as well not exist. Lliwlod assures Arthur that Eryr offers hope and urges him to send over an army. It is clear from the conversation that Arthur has difficulty in understanding or believing that a vast and fertile country exists without development and without a strong organised ruler defending it against incomers. It is made clear that Eryr is not in Britain and can only be reached by sailing. In verse 47 and onwards, King Arthur II makes up his mind to take the army and sail to Eryr. In his final statement, Arthur says that he will sail to Eryr. Verse 51. The Eryr spoken of is remarkable. I desire to go towards there most anciently. What is the limit of the soul? So, a great adventure was set in motion, and a fleet of 700 ships assembled in Doegledif, Milford Haven, in AD 574, to sail west to America. The majority of the force was Cymric, but there is solid evidence of the presence of Lloegr English people taking part in the Great Expedition. Other accounts exist which verify the comet destruction of Britain and the subsequent voyage to America, including the poem Preiddiau Annwn, which means the voyage to the other world, which also gives stark clear detail of this adventure in America, and another detailed account of the mid-6th century destruction of Britain by the comet debris and the subsequent attempt to colonize North America is preserved in the Prophecies of Eryr, which includes the gathering of the 700-ship fleet before it set sail to America. It is provable to the unbiased mind that Cymric scripts and artifacts are found in many areas of the east coast and the midwest of America. These voyages and discoveries are preserved within the Cymric records. These records show that King Arthur II was killed in AD 579 and then had his body embalmed and wrapped and stored through the winter under a cliff overhang, and then taken to an embarkation point in Yarmouth Bay in Nova Scotia. In a way, this makes sense of the strange end of King Arthur that appeared in poetic romance tales in Western Europe some 6 or 8 centuries after his death. The idea of an aged, dying king sailing away across an unknown sea, accompanied by 3 queens in a mysterious boat, has firm roots. We learn from entries in the ancient poetry that 3 ladies of the court washed and embalmed the body of the dead king, and then wrapped the body in a leather bag made from 3 deerskins. Another account of a ship bringing the body of the dead king home exists in the life of Saint Yshtyd, and also in Nennius's Historia Britanniae, which match with accounts in the Garchan Maelderw, the incantation of the Druids, and the Adfynu Taliesin, the courtesy of Taliesin. There is also another clear account in the Preiddiau Annwn, the migration to the other world. Preiddiau Annwn is one of the most famous of all ancient British historical poems. The poem was written by Taliesin, son of Henug, who was the chief bard to Arthur II, and in it Taliesin clearly states that he made the voyage with Arthur. He recounts that 7 persons were sent on a mission of a return trip back to Britain. In it, Taliesin informs us that Arthur is dead and has been embalmed, and that Arthur was in Annwn for 3 years, 3 full seasons fair, and now just 7 persons accompanied him back home. He tells us how 60 slingers were stationed on the fortress walls, and somehow the watch got divided. The Native Americans were after the corn crops, it seems, and standing fields of crops cannot be protected from behind fortress walls. The Native Americans proceeded to circle around the British, and Arthur maintains position by using disciplined tactics. Then it tells us that, on an unknown fine day, the fortress that they had built fell. Arthur then went on to form a defensive perimeter, and so a long-forgotten battle in ancient Kentucky is being laid out before us. The Garchan Maelderw, also by Taliesin, offers additional details such as how Arthur II had been struck down by a Native American, possibly after removing his golden armour, and then describes his followers listening for his pulse. The killer is described as creeping around the rear through thickets without causing alarm, and with one well-aimed thrust of a lance completing the murder. The poem ends with a statement that it is best to let America lie, partitioned off, waiting for the future.